And one more topic. Let's talk about Russia's escalation against NATO. The head of the Bundeswehr, General Carsten Breuer, says that Russia is already waging a hybrid war against NATO countries every day. It is testing reaction speed, looking for weak spots in air defense, and preparing the economy for a broader confrontation with the West. One of the most alarming incidents was the attack in Leipzig. A drone with explosives was found near a Ukrainian transport plane. Another suspected drone collided with a cargo aircraft. The German prosecutor's office is investigating the attack on critical infrastructure, but the perpetrator has not been officially named yet. And on Friday, NATO fighter jets shot down an unidentified drone in Latvian airspace, near the Russian border. The origin of the device is still being determined, but Latvian authorities say it is possible that its route may have been affected by Russian electronic navigation jamming. How far will Russia's escalation against NATO go? Right now, we'll discuss this with journalist and international affairs commentator Alexei Pechiy. He's joining us live. Hello, Alexei. Hello.
Hello, I'm glad to be here.
Likewise. Let's start with the incident in Leipzig, or rather not just the incident in Leipzig, but with the statement from the German general who talks about a daily hybrid war. But the incident in Leipzig, isn't it an indication that what's happening should already be called something else?
Well, actually, let's figure out what definition we can use for this. If you are hinting that this could be called a direct escalation, a direct attack by Russia on the North Atlantic Alliance, then unfortunately no. And the Europeans won't call it that either, simply because that would mean they have to act. They would then have to take some kind of action in response. What kind? That's hard to answer. That's why everything is focused on defensive actions right now. And you know, at the same time, when a German general announced this, there was a statement that the Europeans finally want to build a kind of drone wall along the entire eastern flank of NATO, which will be controlled by artificial intelligence with satellite communication, a control center in Wiesbaden, and so on. So everything is focused specifically on defense, meaning the construction of exactly this kind of defensive line. And as for the escalations that the Kremlin continues every day, all these provocations, sabotage and so on, I think the Kremlin will only keep escalating this. But in the near future, the Kremlin is unlikely to resort to a direct attack, a direct confrontation. Why will it increase? Because, as we've noticed, part of the Kremlin's tactic of intensifying these provocations is working, in the sense that Europe is forced to use more resources to spend more money on its own defense. And in any case, unfortunately, this reduces some of the aid to Ukraine. The Kremlin has noticed this, and the Kremlin will carry out more and more acts of sabotage like this. But pay attention to how the Kremlin operates. That is, recently in the Baltic countries, people have started talking about the possibility of little green men appearing, who might enter the territory of one of the Baltic states. Not exactly, because if we track the actions of the Russians there over the past year, for example, then we will see that all the sabotage and all the provocations are not carried out by Russians, not by Russian spies. That is, they have switched to a tactic where they hire temporary agents, often even among citizens of the European Union, who carry out this sabotage. And then they can get rid of this so-called agent altogether, or pay him some small amount and then say that they have nothing to do with it at all. If this leads to success in the eyes of the Kremlin, meaning if it's some kind of military operation that results in even a small victory for the Kremlin will say, yes, it was us. If none of this helped, and for them it's a defeat or just a neutral situation, they'll say, it wasn't us. And Putin will continue to act this way. And you see, there's a double game being played here. On one hand, by increasing provocations against Europe, he ensures that Europe becomes more and more focused on itself, on its own defense. And accordingly, it might help Ukraine a little less. We can see this now with the Patriot interceptor missiles. Patriot. Why do European countries, the ones that have these missiles, it's no secret, they have them. The Americans also have a shortage. In Europe, they have them on bases, but they don't want to give them away because, understandably, they are afraid they might need them themselves. And what happens if they give these Patriot missiles to Ukraine and, let's say, Russia starts a direct attack on, for example, Poland or the Baltic countries tomorrow? How will they replenish their own stockpiles of these missiles? The Americans don't have them. Trump won't give these missiles now. That's why it works. On the other hand, pay attention to the rhetoric of Sergei Lavrov and his deputies, who have started talking about this being a war for the 1,000-year history of the Russian state, and so on. So this is already a change in rhetoric to say that everyone around is an enemy, everyone is attacking us, and notice what is NATO doing. Look at what NATO is doing. They are moving troops into the Baltic countries. They are not doing this for nothing. So Putin is deliberately provoking this situation so that NATO will respond in a fully appropriate and reasonable way. NATO is responding. NATO is strengthening its defenses on its flanks. And the Kremlin is using this as a scare tactic for its own society, saying, look, we were right. NATO is still moving troops toward us. And this works in both directions. And I think that in the near future, Putin will act within exactly this framework.
But still, there could be, let's say, some circumstance that breaks this whole logic and leads to some real escalation, if not a big war. Again, let's take this case in Leipzig. It was a lucky coincidence that this drone didn't detonate, but there could have been a detonation near the Ukrainian plane, which apparently had ammunition on board, and there could have been a large number of casualties. And even then, that still wouldn't be considered an attack on a NATO country.
Regarding the ammunition, as far as I know, the police in Germany said that there was no ammunition on board at that time. On the other hand, I generally don't like these what-if scenarios, but okay, let's suppose that if this drone had actually attacked the plane and it really had exploded. And whose plane was it? The plane was Ukrainian. Would they have immediately found signs of Russian involvement in this? Well, you see, even now, when the incident didn't happen, fortunately, and the German prosecutor's office says, well, we are investigating. How long will this investigation take? A very long time. Let's take another example. Around the same time, give or take, an actual Russian missile flew into Poland, traveled a full 70 kilometers into Poland, and specifically fell in a field, exploded. Everyone saw the crater. What was NATO's reaction? Can this be considered an attack or not? Or can it be said that this is just a side effect, an effect of this war? That's why it's difficult here. And NATO will act in exactly the same way until the very end. And let's also be honest and objective. It's not in NATO's interest to react very sharply to such incidents. Well, what do we expect? Let's say hypothetically that this drone crashes into a plane and explodes. And what do we expect NATO countries to do? Will they immediately respond by attacking Moscow? Why would they do that? Remember the main principle of the entire NATO charter. It's a defensive alliance and its main task is deterrence. Deterrence as much as possible. Accordingly, they will hold back until the very end. On the other hand, don't forget that right now there is a total review of the deployment of American troops in Europe. This will continue until the end of the year. The assessment will go on until the end of the year. Where and how many troops to leave? Which country? How much each is ready to take on for its own defense? How much money European countries allocate? How much weaponry they will purchase from the Americans? How much they can provide themselves? And so on and so on. That is, this conventional defense, it will be discussed and transformed until the end of this year. Accordingly, while this transitional period is ongoing, it's unlikely that anyone will go looking for trouble or respond very sharply right now. Therefore, they will keep balancing until they build up their defense. But even when they do, let me remind you again, this is a defensive alliance. No one will directly go on the offensive. Moreover, I admit that even if, hypothetically, Russia really starts some kind of small victorious war in the Baltic countries and God forbid captures some piece of land, this will become a matter of bargaining, a matter of diplomacy, and so on. That is, I don't see a scenario where NATO not only pushes these troops out, but also goes deeper into Russia. No, at most they will push them out. And, well, a more realistic scenario is negotiations.
Well, there are also changes in NATO's defensive actions, by the way. They started shooting down drones in Latvia on Friday, yes. Before that, there were cases in Estonia and even earlier in Latvia. This is partly because in the Baltic countries, the mission is now not just air policing, but specifically air defense. And that gives the right to shoot down. Today, by the way, a drone was shot down in Romania. There were several shot down there before as well. But these are all single drones flying into NATO countries' territory. Again, in the Baltic countries, there is a lot of talk about provocations by Russia, like a false flag operation. And it could be connected to drones as well. There were reports that Russia is collecting debris from Ukrainian drones that were shot down on its territory, repairing them, assembling them, and making them look like Ukrainian drones. For what purpose? Well, there probably aren't many possible answers. We can more or less understand why. But will NATO countries be ready if instead of just one stray drone, let's say 10 or so of them fly in? What will they use to shoot them down?
You know, about half a year ago, I would have said they weren't ready. Now I can say they're more ready than not. Because really, in the North Atlantic Alliance, they have started to wake up, started to take action, started to rewrite doctrines, stopped looking back at what was written 70 years ago, and the picture is changing. And no matter how skeptical we may be, by the way, about the American NATO 3.0 strategy, it is also working. We also need to be honest. The era of the Cold War ended a long time ago. The Americans have completely different interests. That is, their strategic interest is the Indo-Pacific regions, and they want to shift all their efforts there. That's why they are pushing and, as we say in Ukrainian, they are spurring Europe to not just wake up, not just allocate more money for weapons, not just focus more attention on its own defense, but also to change its approach. And we see that it is changing. Europe is changing its approaches. Europe understands the reality it has found itself in. And you know, the more Putin tries to provoke all this, the more NATO shows that they are still united. Because just recently, I think you definitely saw this, there was an investigation in the Washington Post about how in December of last year, Vladimir Putin gathered the security officials and said, let's show by 2026 that NATO and the European Union could fall apart from within, that they don't have a unified position, they don't know how to act, and so on. And remember, at the beginning of our conversation, you recalled that episode when, right before this, a drone was shot down over one of the Baltic countries. Did you notice which fighter jets were there when they shot it down? I was surprised. One of them was Turkish. This shows that NATO is united. In other words, these are not isolated episodes of individual countries reacting. This unity was on full display. On the other hand, here's another important point that we often forget. We try to analyze the situation from the perspective of Western democracy, a rational approach. But we forget that Russia and the Putin regime live in a completely different paradigm, a totally different one. You know, a lot of people laughed when Putin said, there is action there, war is action. Recently he said, well, what, the war will end and what will we do? Actually, that's his subconscious speaking. He understands perfectly well that when the war ends, what will he do next? Well, he remembers historical examples like Milosevic very well. While he was at war, he somehow managed to hold on to power. Then the war ended, he made some concessions to NATO, and it seemed like the situation stabilized. Because if we look at the sociology of those years, the Serbs weren't really against the fact that the war finally ended, even with some concessions. But Milosevic was removed. He was removed a year and a half later. There are also other examples, like Argentina in the 1980s, when the ruling junta decided they needed to strengthen their power, and they decided to seize the Falkland Islands. They thought, well, it's far away from Britain itself. These are just some separate islands. A small victorious war. No one will really react strongly. And if anything happens, we'll negotiate later. But the British responded, and within a few days, the main general there was simply removed. Putin understands perfectly well that as soon as the war really ends, he'll have to answer to society about what comes next. Society in Russia is in this frenzy right now, and yes, it really doesn't pay attention to many things, economic problems, social problems, but later they'll have to deal with them. But that's only half the trouble for Putin. And the second big problem for him is that his whole inner circle, all these clans, over the years of this full-scale war, they've also built their own business strategies, making money of this war. But if the war ends, how will they keep making money? Their whole system will collapse. That's why Putin, he understands that if we start getting closer, by the way, that's also a big risk. And whether it's Donald Trump or not, it doesn't matter who, starts initiating negotiations again. And once more, Putin will be pushed to the point where he has to agree. That's when there might be a risk that he really stages some kind of provocation. in those same Baltic states, using the same drones they've assembled from spare parts, those drones from Ukraine that were flying. He might do it. Why? Because he can't negotiate. He's entered that phase of the war where any agreement, any negotiations are a loss for him. That's why, for example, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, says that he needs to be pressured. His inner circle needs to be pressured, and Russia's income needs to be cut as much as possible. Hit their exports, hit them with sanctions. We impose our own sanctions. Let the West impose theirs. The goal is simply to make it impossible to wage war. As long as there is an opportunity, Putin will cling to this war. Without the war, that's it. His regime will collapse. Because, well, history shows that after a big war, always, no matter which country, whether the winner or the loser, depression sets in, a period of decline begins. And in this decline, you have to somehow explain how we got here and how to get out of it. So how will Putin answer to his own society? How will he get out of it? Well, how?
Yes, Alexei, thank you very much. I just want to add one more detail to confirm your point about NATO's unity. In Latvia, a drone was shot down by Turkish fighter jets that took off from an airfield in Lithuania, in Šiauliai.
Just think
so now
about
we
it
have
for
three
a second.
countries involved.
This is an important point. It really shows consolidation. These little things, it would seem, but they show that NATO is not just some fragmented alliance where everyone acts on their own.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.